Hey kids, how are you guys doing today?
Good.
Excellent. Well, my name is Joe Ozier, and I'm an author, and I just wrote my first book, and I'm also a dog behavior trainer, so I help people with dogs that have issues like biting and jumping and chewing and aggression towards other dogs and all kinds of things like that. But I wrote this book about a dog that I rescued when I was living in Florida. She had been living on the streets for 2 years. That's a long time. So she had built up her tolerances for being hungry and for her trust issues and things like that. And she had been begging at a fire station. And one of the firemen at the fire station said, you know, we feed this dog for a long time, but I think this dog needs a really good home. So they caught it and they took it to the shelter, and that's part of what the story's about, because it's a true story. And eventually, when I got Shay and I adopted her, she had issues, and that happens a lot with dog owners who will take a dog off the street that they know really nothing about, and they bring it home and they expect it to listen and pay attention and not do all kinds of things that they might not expect. But sure enough, dogs have developed a certain sense for the environment around them and for the people that they either trust or don't trust. So you have to kind of change those dog behaviors to let them know that now that it's safe for them, and now that they're loved, and now that they can relax and have a real relationship with a family or a dog owner that's there to help them and protect them and to give them a nice life. And so, because you're children, I have a little fun exercise for you today, because what I want to do is I want to have you participate in the story that I'm going to be reading. And so part of the participation is I'm going to have you do things like this. Now, can you make a sound like a fireman? Like a fire truck? Let's hear it. Right? You hear them all the time, every day. Fire truck blowing through town, right? So, and then how about this one? There you go. So I have several of these that I want you to participate in as we go along, and I will give you the clues by holding this up and letting you do your little thing, and then I'll put it down, and then we can proceed from there. So, you guys ready?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Shay the Runaway was a dog that lived for 2 years on the streets. Every day of her life was a struggle to survive. She learned that eating food out of trash cans could keep her alive, but it also brought her lots of unwanted attention. Everyone she came across was always yelling and throwing things at her, and she thought that this was the way dogs were supposed to live, because it was the only life she knew. She never knew what it meant to have a real home. She lived and slept on the cold and sometimes mean streets of the town. She was always on the run and moving from place to place. She never slept in the same spot 2 nights in a row. The nights were cold, and the people she met were mostly unfriendly. She believed that this is how her life would always be. One of her favorite places to beg for food and water was the local fire station. The firemen were always happy to give Shay food because they could see that she was very hungry and that she looked helpless and alone. "The poor girl is homeless," said one fireman. "She has a very kind-looking face, but nobody has taken care of her. Just look at how skinny and dirty she is. The poor dog needs my help." So, on that particular day, the kind-hearted fireman gave her a ride in the fire truck all the way to the closest city. The fire truck stopped at the Humane Society, and Shay was taken inside and given a bath. It was the first bath of her life, so she struggled and tried to get away, but when she realized that the people scrubbing her weren't hurting her and that she was smelling a whole lot better, she started to enjoy it. Joe was a nice middle-aged man who lived alone. He worked all day at the library, and when he came home, he enjoyed watching television to help him unwind. After a long week, he was settling in for a quiet weekend when a commercial came on TV advertising that the local shelter had lots of great pets to adopt. They mentioned how owning a pet can help prevent loneliness and add years to a person's life, not to mention adding years to the dog's life as well. Joe thought to himself, well, I want to live longer, and perhaps I am a bit lonely. Why not at least go down to the shelter and look around? I don't have to adopt a pet if I don't want to. I'll just go and browse around. So, bright and early Saturday morning, Joe drove his car to the shelter and began looking at all the dogs. There were so many different types and sizes of dogs to choose from, but none really jumped out at him as the perfect companion. Joe figured it was meant to be, and so he began to walk towards the exit. Just as Joe was about to leave the shelter, he heard a rather distinctive bark. It was more like a woof than an actual bark. Shay looked like she felt the same way about Joe. Joe couldn't believe how Shay made him feel. Shay got her shots. Shay looked like she felt the same way about Joe. So Joe adopted Shay. Wow. Shay got her shots, her dog tag, and her microchip. Joe got a list of how to safely prepare his home for his new arrival. Joe then bought a big bag of healthy dog food from the pet store and drove Shay home. Joe took a bowl out of his cupboard and painted the name Shay on it in big bold letters. Joe filled that bowl with dog food and set it on his porch, right in front of her. Shay couldn't believe that Joe had given her his food, just like that. Well, Shay quickly ate every tasty kibble in that bowl. Joe and Shay both realized that they were happier than they had been in years. Joe watched with pride as Shay wandered around his backyard, sniffing everything in her path. Not a big sniffer, are you? Okay. After a few minutes, Joe went back inside his home to make the necessary preparations for his new family member. Shay kept exploring her new yard, and after a few minutes, she noticed a hole in the fence. Her survival instincts always told her to never stop and to always keep moving, so she squeezed through that hole and was gone in a flash. A few minutes later, Joe came back outside to check on his dog, but Shay was nowhere to be found. He looked everywhere for her, but no Shay. All he found was Shay's empty dog bowl. Joe got in his car and drove around the neighborhood, calling out her name, but he could not find her. His heart sank at the thought of losing his new best friend. He wondered if he would ever see Shay again.
Shay! Shay!
After hours of driving the neighborhood, Joe came back home feeling very sad and worried about losing his new dog. As he entered his home, his phone was ringing, and to his surprise and joy, it was an officer from the Humane Society. He told Joe that he had caught Shay running in an alley. Joe said Shay must have escaped through a hole in his fence. the man told Joe he could come and get Shay anytime after Joe fixed all the holes in his fence. He also told Joe that some dogs who have lived on the streets for a very long time tend to go back to that life because it's the only life they know. He said that some wild dogs can't live the simple life in a home and that perhaps Shay can never be tamed. Joe went out into his backyard and walked all along his fence line until he discovered where Shay had escaped. He felt so guilty. He blamed himself for not preparing his yard properly for his new guest. So for the next few hours, Joe did what he could do to fix all the holes in his fence. He checked and rechecked all the places along his fence where Shay might escape, because he loved Shay and couldn't bear the thought of her wandering somewhere out in the world again, all alone without him. Joe felt his yard was finally ready, so he drove back to the Humane Society and picked up his dog. Joe was so happy. Shay looked happy too. Joe brought Shay home again, and the two of them walked all around the yard. Shay didn't seem like she was looking to find another way to get out. After they had their walk, they both sat together in Joe's backyard, enjoying each other's company. Joe sat on his backyard lounge chair, petting Shay the rest of the day. Joe seemed very confident that Shay could not get through his fence, so the next morning he went to work without any worries. Shay found herself alone again in the yard. Once again, Shay's survival instinct told her to keep moving and to run away. Within a few minutes, Shay found a bit of soft dirt under a part of the fence. With the determination of a trapped animal, Shay dug and dug until she was free. She squeezed under the fence and ran away without a care in the world. When Joe came back home, he couldn't wait to see his new best friend. He went straight to the backyard and called for her, but she didn't come. Joe walked around his yard to find Shay, but what he found instead was a hole under his fence. He immediately called the Humane Society, but they told him she wasn't there. They reminded Joe about what he needed to do to make sure Shay couldn't get out. Joe told them that he had fixed all the holes in his fence, but that she had dug under his fence. They were disappointed and saddened by his loss. They told him that perhaps he was incapable of taking care of a runaway dog like Shay. After running for hours, Shay stopped under a tree to rest. She thought that it felt good to be back in the wild, living on her own again and being the master of her own destiny. Then suddenly a strange feeling came over her. She began thinking about what had happened to her over the last few days. She thought about the man who gave her his home and who fed her and how she had enjoyed sitting next to him as he petted her. Then she remembered sleeping in the alleys filled with trash and of the garbage cans that would be providing all of her future meals. Her survival instinct told her what to do next. She turned around and started to run, putting all of her canine senses into high gear. She began to see landmarks and familiar streets and smelled familiar things, so she began to run even faster. Finally, she came upon a neighborhood that looked right. It took her a few moments to get her bearings, but she found that familiar fence and slipped back through that same hole she had escaped from. When she was safely inside the yard, she jumped onto the lounge chair and waited for that nice man who had sat there once before, petting her. She never felt happier in all of her life. Her instinct now told her that she could stop running because she had found her forever home and her place in life on Shay's Lounge. The end.